Well, I keep having people ask me, how did your dad convince you to do this? And the truth is, my dad has been trying to convince me to do this for a couple years. And I just kept saying, oh, just give me a couple more months. Just give me a couple more months. And then a few weeks ago, my dad got up and he announced that we were going to 2 services on Easter. And I said, I'll do Palm Sunday. So I'm a business person, not a speaker normally, and so my business mind went, 1 service or 2? I think I'll take 1. So I'm going to take the last available opportunity today to only have to speak once in doing this. So that's how I got up here today. I will go ahead and just kind of jump right into this today. I'm sort of doing a weird thing where I'm not sticking to one story. I've got quite a few stories from the Bible, and so I want to jump right in here. So Genesis 1 through 5 is where we're going to start, the very beginning. Genesis 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form, and it was void, and darkness was over everything. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the very first day. Communion without the cross, roses without thorns, God in a garden with man still unscorned, worship unhindered, nakedness no shame, Emmanuel here, vulnerability untamed, complete dominion, kings of it all, except for self, our one downfall. A chink in the armor, the serpent saw. All it took, a suggestion. We could be lords of it all. King seems weak when Lord is on the line. Godship for kingship, we'll take the apple every time. The bait was bit, the hook sunk in. Control of self, the deadliest of sins. The ground mutinied, a lamb was slain. It covered our nakedness, but it couldn't touch the pain. Learning to fend for ourselves while carrying all this shame, with no God and no garden, only each other left to blame. Love is lost. Life is cut short. God was in the garden, but we traded beauty for thorns. The barter was bad, but the bed was already made. Ashes for beauty, health for pain. The story of the fall, so painful to tell, yet we continue to repeat, continue to rebel. Genesis 1 through 4, and really this whole story is very, very difficult to read. It starts out with a beautiful creator and beautiful creation, but very quickly the depravity of man wreaks havoc on the entire story, and it doesn't stop in the garden. Adam and Eve make it out alive. They survive the curse, and just as we see hope re-enter the story when their sons Cain and Abel are born, it's dashed again, because we're not even given a whole verse to dwell on that. Cain soon kills Abel. The forbidden fruit has mutated. It's no longer just control of self that we're after. We're after control of others. The population continues to grow, and so does this forbidden fruit. And soon it seems that once forbidden fruit has become the diet of choice. But in this mess, we find a man named Noah who still has some communication with God. And in this communication with God, he's offered an ark to be saved from a flood that will destroy everyone else. The saddest part of this story is we discover the fruit must float because the flood doesn't destroy it like it does everyone. Soon after, we find Noah is back to munching on this toxic fruit. His family grows, and it's called to repopulate the earth. And it continues to grow, and we've got lots of verses about the generations that come after. And soon we see the Tower of Babel being built. The Tower of Babel was this great construction project where the entire population was coming together. And the thing that sort of enabled them to do this was their ability to communicate with each other. And they were going to try to build this tower that would get them to the heights of God. It was once again going after that promise that the serpent gave much earlier in the story with Adam and Eve. But God, in his grace, decided not to allow them to waste their lives on a construction project with an impossible goal. And he confused their languages. And so, like me and you speaking right now in English, suddenly we've got someone speaking in Spanish and someone speaking in this. And in all the confusion, the construction project was no longer possible. And it forced them to scatter. And in my opinion, caused them to go back to the original mandate, to populate and subdue the earth. And soon after this, we find the story of ultimate salvation setting in when God calls Abram out of the city of sin that he's living in. In this story, it's amazing because Abram was such a critical character in the Bible that we not only know God by his name, but we know God by who he's associated with. And that's Abram turned Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and one of my favorites, and my 2-year-old daughter's favorites, his son, Joseph. The story of Joseph in the Bible is 13 chapters long, and I think it would be difficult to read all of those to you and keep you awake and also keep my throat intact. So in order to not tell you that whole story but give you a bit of the gist, I'm going to tell it to you the same way we tell it to our 2-year-old daughter at home. Julia, invite Ben.
Joseph and the coat of many colors. Joseph was a bright young man, his father's pride and joy. "My son, you are my favorite one," this dad said to his boy. Then Joseph's father grinned. "Guess what? I've got a gift for you." Joseph was excited. Something awesome, something new. A coat of many colors. Joseph put it on with glee, but his brothers only grumbled and looked on with jealousy. Orange and purple, red and yellow, green and royal blue. Of course, his many brothers wanted rainbow jackets too. Then Joseph had a dream from God. Strange visions filled his head. "One day you'll all bow down to me," he confidently said. This made his brothers angry, and they blurted out, "That's it. We'll never do what Joseph says. Let's toss him in a pit." But then they saw a caravan of traders riding by and sold their brother Joseph, who had teardrops in his eyes. Before they left, they stole his coat and brought it to their dad, then lied about their brother. "Something happened. It was bad." Joseph got to Egypt, where they hauled him off to jail. But even in that dungeon, God's compassion didn't fail. Soon Joseph understood the dreams of everyone in prison. "I'm telling Pharaoh you are wise," his friend said. "You have vision." Pharaoh summoned Joseph to his sparkling palace gates. "I've had the strangest dreams, so Joseph, tell me, what's my fate?" Joseph said, "For 7 years your crops will greatly sprout. For 7 more your food supply will wither and run out." Pharaoh said, "I'm putting you in charge of everything." So Joseph stored up lots of food to help the worried king. The bad years came, and Joseph fed each person, child and lamb. And when his brothers needed help, he asked, "Know who I am?" "It's me, your brother," Joseph said. "I'm grateful that you're here." With humbled hearts, they praised the Lord and cried some happy tears. Because of Joseph, we know God is with us every day, and he has a greater plan for us, whatever comes our way.
I thought in such a serious kind of topic, it would be nice to take a little comedic break, and plus I got to put my husband on the spot and not just me. I think the story well summarizes the grace of God, and that's what we want our 2-year-old to hear. We probably don't want her to delve into every sin theme in the story at 2. Pride, family betrayal, slavery, sexual promiscuity. The forbidden fruit in the story runs just as deep as the grace that Ben just described, and even the story of the reuniting brothers is a bit modified. It wasn't quite such a happy tale. Joseph, though, despite all of these sin themes, the grace of God does run through the story, and it's absolutely amazing. So I do expect you to do your homework and read the 13 chapters at home. Not long after, several generations after, so Joseph's family continues to populate. They continue to remain in Egypt. And unfortunately, as the family grew, so did their power. And as the initial Pharaoh died and you have those generations keep passing, what we find is that the Egyptians ended up rising up and taking over Joseph's family and using them as slaves. So in the Bible, the people who we call Jews now would be referred to as Israelites or Hebrew children. So you may hear me refer to them in that way during this sermon. So this continues, and more generations are being had as they're in this Egyptian slavery. And in this sort of hopeless story where we see the Hebrew children just absolutely enslaved and seemingly no way out, one of the ways that they were actually able to keep them in this story enslaved for so long was the Egyptians had this idea, well, if their population grows too much, they'll be able to overtake us. So they decide every son that's born is going to be thrown into the Nile and eaten by the crocodiles. So it's just a terrible, hopeless story of slavery, of family loss. It's absolutely miserable, and the forbidden fruit just seems like it's everywhere. But in this moment, one son in a generation survives. And what happens is Moses' mother, actually in the Bible it was referred to as Moshe or something along those lines. And Moshe, the name meant to be drawn up out of the water. It was like the sound of water rising up. That's where that Moshe sound comes from, or that name comes from. His mother decides, to continue to raise him, but at 3 months old, he's just crying too much. There's no way they're gonna be able to keep this hidden from the Egyptian, that they've got someone set aside and saved. And so she puts him into the Nile, but she puts him in a basket, and God provides a way out. And so Pharaoh's daughter actually is the one who finds this baby in a basket, and she raises him in Pharaoh's household, and he's raised like an Egyptian from everything that we're told about the story. But there's something in this boy that knows that he doesn't belong, or that he's different, or that his family of origin was different. And the way that we know that he knows that is because one day when he's older, he's out and there's an Egyptian beating a slave, and he rises up against the Egyptian and kills him. And it's such a dangerous position that Moses, the last hope, the one son in a generation that survived, the obvious anchor of this story, runs away and hides out in the desert. And so once again, we're left with this horrible feeling of this slavery that's just absolutely never ending and crushing their people. But after 40 years in the desert, God speaks to Moses, and it must have been just dramatic. I've seen a million retellings of it, and I've seen it on movies, and I just don't think whatever happened must have captured it, because God doesn't exactly give Moses like a great war strategy, which is what I would want if I was going to go back to the Egyptians. He tells them to go back and tell Pharaoh to let his people go and bring his staff. If I was going to be going back to the Egyptians, who have absolute power and have managed for this many years to keep this many people enslaved, I want something more than a staff and my ability to talk. But something in that burning bush experience was so powerful that Moses decides to do it. So he goes back to ask Pharaoh to let the people go. Pharaoh obviously does not let the people go immediately. After 400 years in slavery, he doesn't know anything but forbidden fruit. I mean, there's no good happening in this story. And so what Moses does is, he uses his staff and God tells him what to say, and there's all these plagues and disasters and things that keep coming to the Egyptian people, and the Egyptians still will not let the Hebrew people go. And finally God turns their horrible deed on them. And it's basically the same way that the Hebrews were able to be kept in check, which is, we're going to kill all of your sons. God says, okay, if you don't put the blood of the lamb over your doorpost at this time, at this night, with all these specific specifications, then your oldest sons will all pass away. I mean, it's the exact type of thing that the Egyptians are doing, and we know from the story that it seemingly worked because the people continued to stay enslaved. And that night, an angel of death came across, and the Hebrew people obviously obeyed God's command and put the blood of the lamb over their doorposts. And tragically, many of the sons of, as far as we know, all of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians died. And that story was enough to finally cause the Pharaoh to relent and to say, okay, I'll let the people go. This is the origins really of the Passover story that my dad referred to earlier in the service. It's a feast, a celebration that Jews still celebrate today, that some Christians celebrate as well. And after it, there's so many things in this one story that, once again, you're going to have to go home and do your homework or listen to another sermon on it or read books, because there's so much to dig into there. But that's not the purpose of this entire sermon, so I'm going to ask you to read that at home. So after this Exodus story, after the people are brought out, sort of the next big thing that we see is the law given. So, the law is kind of a thing I feel like Christians want to avoid. Is like, yeah, Jesus abolished the law. Like, we don't really want to dive into all of that and say, what the deal is. But just for the purposes of this, basically, this forbidden fruit that's mutated, this sin that's mutated, has just gone nuts. It's taken over society completely. And even the Hebrew children, God's called out people, are still subject to it. We're sort of slaves to this sin situation. And so what God does initially is he provides 10 commandments, and then even the 10 commandments aren't enough to deal with all the intricacies of the problems that are caused by this fruit that we just keep eating. And so what we see is more laws and laws to deal with family, and laws to deal with this, and laws to deal with how we eat, and they're just, by the end of it, we're just overwhelmed with this huge number of laws to deal with so many different situations for your aunt and your uncle and your cousin and your friends and your food, that nobody's able to keep the law. I mean, it's just an absolutely impossible standard. Nobody can even memorize the law, seemingly, much less keep every piece of it. But God still wants communion with his people. And sort of the situation is, with the level of unholiness that we have, with the constant committing of sins, really even one sin puts us in violation of God. Even that one initial eating of the fruit puts us in violation of God. But it's not like that's all that happened. We just keep eating this fruit, right? So God provides a way for us to continue to be in communion with him, even though we are completely unholy. So what would happen is, in the Old Testament, we see a couple stories of this where people actually were sort of face to face with God, or they saw God up close, or they talked to God up close, and it just wrecked them, really. And in true cases where they were absolutely face to face with God, there was death. And it wasn't, I think sometimes we think of that, and at least I think of that, as this like horrible punishment for sin. And I think to a degree there's some truth in that. But I think a huge part of this is that we're living under the curse. We're living in this sin that we don't even realize the level of degradation to which our bodies, our souls, our everything is experienced. We're living in shame. We're living in embarrassment. We're living in all of this. And when we come face to face with something that's perfect, I mean, we have issues, right, with social media, comparing ourselves to other people. But when you compare yourself to perfection, when you compare yourself to God, there's just no surviving it. And so God provides this way for his people to still be in community or communion with him. And he creates this plan for a temple where his presence is going to dwell in this one place in the Ark of the Covenant. But there's all these rules about like how you have to enter. And once again, we got to keep that in the context of like, this is for our own protection. Because people who disobeyed these rules did end up dying, and it wasn't like God had to strike them with a lightning bolt, it seems. Like, it just seemed like they died. You know, there's a case in the Old Testament where someone touches the Ark of the Covenant on accident, and he's dead. So we're blocked from God's presence out of protection for ourselves. But once a year, there's a priest that's allowed to go in. And what they've done is they've covered this with like this huge curtain of sorts. Like we call it the veil a lot of times. So this veil that covers this room and keeps us out of this room. And when we talk about a curtain, we think of modern day curtains. This curtain, they say, is as thick as a man's hand. The material is as thick as a man's hand. There's different, accounts that you can read. Some people say 30 feet high. Some people say 60 feet high, depending on who you're reading and what translation and whatnot. Whatever the case is, we know this curtain is thick. It's huge. It's not an easy task to get past it, right? And so just once a year, someone's allowed into this holiest of holy places and past this curtain. And there's all of these criteria and things that they have to do to even enter it. And if they get there and they get in the presence of God and they haven't followed these things, they die. And so it's just this really, really sort of tragic situation where God, like we know him now, is somewhat inaccessible to us because of our sin. Our sin has just separated us from it. These laws, we're just not keeping them. Even priests at times find themselves dead in the holiest of holies. Even these people that have set their lives aside. And what we find all throughout the Old Testament is that these animal sacrifices, these laws, these different things, they have certainly pushed back the curse of death, but they absolutely have not stopped it. And death still has the final answer. Let's jump over to John 1. And just like Genesis 1 through 5, we're going to read John 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Millennia later, and all still the same. Sin over and over, repent and then shame. Can't fix the problem, beginnings come again. We hear God's in the garden, no man cannot win. O Garden of Gethsemane, why taunt us now? God's in the garden, but we'll choose the golden cow. We'll listen to your story, although we know the end. God is in the garden, so man will surely sin. All at our disposal, only one thing is asked. Don't sleep on the job. This prayer may be his last. Jesus prays in anguish, the world's weight on his back. Disciples pray with full stomachs, they'll soon hit the sack. Can you really blame disciples? The Passover barely through, their Last Supper one to remember, more than they even knew. So back to the God in the garden and the story of failing men. It seems this tale as old as time has happened once again. The climax is predictable. No prophets needed to foretell. They'll be locked out of the garden, and God will no longer dwell. Stop telling us this story. It nails us every time. The chronicle is cursed. It's not a nursery rhyme. Was Genesis not enough? Why repeat it all again? But God's back in the garden, and man again his friends. Forget the fall, just skip it, jump right past it to the end. No one wants this repeat. There's no will left to defend. Genesis and John contradictory? Yes, their stories will diverge. The one in chains, it isn't you. Is your sentencing adjourned? God should be in the garden. Humanity gets locked out. But now God's walked out and chained, and we're free to wander all about. The guards must be confused. Mankind broke the rules. When we thought it couldn't get worse, the story gets more cruel. The trade is made. The rose of Sharon sprouted thorns. As pardon for the sin, he will take the scorn. The story isn't over. We know an animal must die. So here we find the first martyr, the lamb slain before time. For the first and the last time in history, an innocent man died. There's not one of us in this room that if we died right now would die innocent. There's not one that's lived before that would die and die innocent. The creator of the universe stepped down and took the punishment for us all. He tasted the forbidden fruit and took death upon himself so that you would not have to experience this. And he did it so that he could have communion once again with us. When Jesus died, it was so dramatic that the earth quakes with the injustice. I mean, literally, there was an earthquake as he dies. And when the earthquake occurs, the veil that's as thick as a man's hand, the veil that's incredibly tall, rips, it tears from top to bottom. And there's this moment when you read it that you realize the throne room is open. The throne room is open to you. And it's because of what he's done here on the cross. He's paid the price for all of those times that you've eaten that fruit, that you've known that you've done wrong, that you've continued to do it again, that you've fought your flesh, and yet you've found that there's absolutely no going back, that you just sin over and over again. God took that punishment. And now, unlike the Old Testament, we can go into the throne room. We can actually go up. We can go experience even the presence of God without shame, without embarrassment, without death. Communion is one way that we regularly commit ourselves to the remembrance of this story, the remembrance of what he did for us. The Bible says on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take this as often as you do it in remembrance of me." A few years ago, I walked into my back door, having a normal day, not thinking anything out of the ordinary, and I turned right to the left was my kitchen, and I turned into the kitchen and looked up and saw a very surprising scene. I saw my husband who's not much of a crier. For any of you who know him, emotion isn't his big strong suit. He's not like that. He's weeping. He's got tears down his face, and it just absolutely shocked me. And I sort of racked my brain for the couple seconds of silence on what could be going on, and I couldn't place it. The people that you would worry about dying in your lives had already died. Ben's grandparents who raised him, his grandma was the last one to pass, and she had passed about 2 years before that. So it's got to be some very unusual emergency in my mind, of whatever is causing this moment. And Ben breaks the silence. He was holding a sandwich in his hands, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And he said, "This is the last strawberry jelly." His grandma made a strawberry freezer jam every year and would supply the whole family with it. And I walked in on this moment where Ben was eating the very last of the strawberry jam that his grandmother had made on a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And in this moment of remembrance, he's got tears running down his eyes. It was a very strange thing to walk in on, and it almost felt like a holy moment, and I didn't know what to say. And Ben looks at me, he's like, take a bite. And I'm like, I can't take a bite, it's not my grandma. It's your sandwich. I cannot take a bite of that sandwich. And Ben's like, no, I want you to do this with me. So I walked over to the kitchen island where he was standing and bit into this bite of this bittersweet sandwich. And experienced a moment with him in complete silence of remembrance of his grandmother who had meant so much to us. I think in that moment, sort of communion was experienced in my mind for the first time in a new or a different way. I've had communion my whole life. I've had it as a part of every service. But I didn't know Jesus in the flesh when he was here 2,000 years ago. And I didn't understand what that must have been like for his disciples who had. And I certainly had never experienced it in the same power of that moment that I was having with Ben in the kitchen. So each time we have communion now, I remember the peanut butter and jelly sandwich and try to take it with that level of seriousness and that level of remembrance as I take the bread and the juice. Today, because I got to run the service, I get to do it my way. I decided to do communion a little bit differently. One, we normally do it during the beginning, and I saved it for the end of service. But two, I wanted you to have something to remember, for it to be something a little bit different. And so Kelly's going to actually be passing out communion today. You'll still get, in the seat backs in front of you, there's a juice cup. I want you to go ahead and take that out of the seats, and we'll take that here in a minute. But today what I've asked is for my mom to make homemade bread. And I had her make some strawberry freezer jam. And I got some peanut butter packaged up. And we're going to hand those out to you. And as you take communion today, I'd like you to take this as a remembrance, to really take some time and experience it. I don't know if you noticed, but earlier in the service, Tanner sang a new song. And one of the bridge of the song is, I come to the throne room before you. This is your opportunity. And there's opportunities all day long, every day, but not every day, not every moment are you set aside in a time like this, in a service like this, where you have the opportunity to really focus in, where you don't have all the distractions around you that you have at work or at home, so you can have this anywhere. And Jesus is available to you anywhere, but I'm asking right now for you to take this moment as a moment of remembrance and to experience Jesus and to enter the throne room and to see his presence and to meet God face to face. I'll wait as these are getting passed out for a minute. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take this as often as you do it in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he took the cup and said, "This is the new covenant of my blood. Drink this as often as you do it in remembrance of me." As you get your bread, feel free to eat or not eat the peanut butter and jelly. Take it, and I invite you, as we're singing this song, to experience the throne room.